To the world, Barry Gibb was the last Bee Gees standing, iconic, polished, unshakable. But at home, behind the music and the memories, there was someone else holding him together. Her name was Linda, his wife for over 50 years. And without her, Barry admits, he might not have made it. For decades, he stayed quiet about what she gave up, what she endured, and how many times she pulled him back from the edge. But now, at 78, he's finally revealing the truth. Not for headlines, not for tribute, but because it's time people knew who really saved him. And the story he just shared is as heartbreaking as it is beautiful. Barry Gibb met Linda Gray in 1967. She wasn't a fan chasing fame or someone dazzled by the Bee Gees' rising spotlight. She was a beauty queen, Miss Edinburgh to be exact, with a mind of her own, a calm presence, and an uncanny ability to see past the surface. She met Barry before the world truly claimed him, and maybe that's why she held on when so many others would have let go. They married in 1970, and from the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. A rock star at the peak of his powers, a radiant young wife by his side, glamour, success, beautiful homes, 5 children. But what most people didn't see, what Barry rarely let slip, was how fragile he really felt once the lights dimmed, and how often Linda had to step in to keep him from disappearing under the weight of it all. Because being Barry Gibb wasn't easy. He lost 3 brothers, one by one. First Andy, the baby of the family, then Maurice, his musical twin, and finally Robin, the voice that had harmonized beside him since they were kids. Each death stripped something away, and Linda, she stayed, through all of it. She was there when Barry sank into silence after Andy passed in 1988. There when the Bee Gees tried to carry on. There when Maurice died suddenly in 2003, and Barry couldn't find the words to speak publicly. And when Robin's voice went quiet in 2012, Linda watched her husband fade into a kind of emotional exile. But she didn't leave. She didn't push. She simply stood beside him, quietly catching what the world couldn't see him dropping. In private, Barry has always been deeply emotional, more fragile than his stage presence lets on. He once admitted that fame came with a loneliness he never expected. That despite the crowds, the awards, the endless applause, he often felt like no one really knew him. No one except Linda. She saw the parts of me I didn't want to show, he confessed. Not in a press release, not at an awards show, but privately, in a moment that wasn't meant to be part of any public record. She was there when I didn't even recognize myself. Linda lived through the chaos of the 1970s Bee Gees explosion, the global mania of Saturday Night Fever, the family fights, the addiction crises, and the relentless pressure to stay relevant in a music world that chews up legends faster than it crowns them. And through it all, she refused to become a public figure. She didn't give interviews. She didn't chase press. She stayed home, raised their children, kept their life from unraveling behind the scenes. That choice, her retreat from the spotlight, wasn't because she was weak. It was because she knew what Barry needed. He didn't need another manager. He didn't need another critic. He needed a home, constant, and Linda became that for 5 decades. But the heartbreak in Barry's recent reflection doesn't just come from gratitude. It comes from regret, because in staying strong for him, Linda gave up pieces of herself, quietly, without resentment. And now, looking back, Barry sees what she carried. There were times he was gone for months. Tours, rehearsals, recording sessions. There were nights he came home but wasn't really there. Lost in grief, in exhaustion, in memory. And Linda never asked for anything in return. She just kept the light on, kept the family together, kept him tethered to the life he might have lost without her. Fans often ask Barry how he survived all the losses, how he stayed grounded after losing Andy, Maurice, and Robin. And he always gives credit to the music, the fans, the legacy. But now, at 78, he's changed his answer. He survived because of Linda, and for the first time, he's saying so. It wasn't just emotional strength that kept Linda beside Barry. It was endurance, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that rarely gets acknowledged. For decades, she was the one absorbing the turbulence so Barry could keep moving. And while the world saw him as the anchor of the Bee Gees, she was the anchor of him. In the early days, when the Bee Gees were still climbing, Linda dealt with long stretches of absence. Barry was flying between continents, living in studios, performing night after night. The spotlight was unforgiving, and the expectations were even harsher. There were always people around Barry, agents, producers, fans, but very few truly saw the toll it took. Linda did. She watched the pressure build. She saw the fatigue behind his eyes when he came home. And even when he couldn't find the words, she understood what he was carrying. And then came the fame explosion. By the late 70s, the Bee Gees were everywhere. Saturday Night Fever made them global icons overnight. Their songs weren't just hits, they were cultural phenomena. But fame that loud often silences everything else. Barry became a symbol, a legend, and Linda became invisible to most of the world. Not because she lacked presence, but because she chose not to compete with the glare of stardom. That wasn't easy. Every time a red carpet rolled out, Linda stayed home. Every time an award was handed out, she watched from a distance. It was a life of waiting, of sacrificing, of knowing that the man she loved belonged, at least partially, to the world. But she never made him choose. She never asked him to slow down. She just made sure he had something to come home to when the crowd faded. Privately, Barry has said that Linda's strength often scared him. Not because she was harsh, but because she was so unshakable. In the moments when he fell apart, when grief became unbearable, or the guilt over Andy's death crushed him, she never mirrored his collapse. She stayed grounded, calm, steady. He called her the calm in the madness, and he meant it. When Maurice passed in 2003, it shattered Barry in ways even he didn't anticipate. The twins, Maurice and Robin, had always been his balance. They understood the rhythm of his thoughts, the shorthand of shared memories. And when one of them disappeared, something inside Barry broke. He became withdrawn, quiet. The world noticed the absence of Bee Gees harmonies. But Linda noticed the silence at the dinner table. The empty stare, the weight he couldn't shake. Still, she didn't push. She didn't try to fix it. She simply held the space for him to exist inside it. Later, when Robin died, it was Linda who urged Barry to grieve, not just perform. To stop pretending he was okay just because the world needed a surviving BG. She reminded him that he was a man before he was a legacy, and a husband before he was a frontman. That kind of love doesn't come with fireworks or grand gestures. It comes with quiet hands, long nights, whispered reassurances, and thousands of little moments that no camera ever caught. And maybe that's why Barry waited so long to talk about it. Because Linda's love wasn't the kind you post about. It wasn't performative. It was sacred. And for years, he kept it to himself, guarding it the way she had guarded him, fiercely and silently. But recently, something shifted. Barry began speaking about Linda in a new way. With reverence, yes, but also with confession. He began to say what he hadn't before. That there were times he took her for granted. That in the chaos of fame and the fog of grief, he didn't always say thank you. That she deserved more than just loyalty. She deserved acknowledgement. And now, at 78, he's trying to give her that. Not in interviews, not on stage, but in the way he tells their story differently now. The way he highlights her presence, not just his perseverance. Because Barry Gibb didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because Linda was. There was one moment Barry Gibb never talks about on stage. One night shortly after Andy's death, when the weight of everything became too much. The house was quiet. The children were asleep. And Barry, overwhelmed by the grief he had locked away for weeks, sat alone in the hallway with his head in his hands. The same man who had just performed in front of thousands couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. And it was Linda who found him there. She didn't ask questions. She didn't tell him to get up. She just sat beside him on the floor. And after a few minutes, without saying a word, she reached over and held his hand. That's the kind of love they had. Not flashy, not dramatic, but so deeply embedded in their daily lives that it became invisible to everyone else. Linda didn't need to rescue Barry. She just needed him to know he wasn't alone. He would carry that moment with him for the rest of his life. And though he rarely talks about it publicly, those small, quiet acts became the thread that held him together, especially when his world began to fall apart again, piece by piece. When Maurice died in 2003, the press hounded Barry for a statement. Fans waited for him to sing again, but what they didn't see was the way he froze. For days he couldn't speak, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because his grief had finally stolen his voice. It was Linda who spoke for him, Linda who helped him out of bed, Linda who reminded him that Maurice wouldn't want him to disappear. And once again, Barry didn't announce it. He didn't post tributes. He just leaned on her, the only person who knew what the silence really meant. But the years that followed weren't just about loss. They were also about reflection. And with each passing birthday, Barry found himself looking at Linda differently, not as the woman who stood by him, but as the woman who chose to. There were opportunities for her to walk away, moments when the fame was too much, times when Barry's grief made him distant, when the BG schedule pulled him away from home for months at a time, when his own emotional turmoil turned him into someone she didn't always recognize. And yet, she stayed. She stayed through the chaos, through the loneliness, through the aftermath of 3 lost brothers and a lifetime in the public eye. She stayed not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Barry has said quietly to those closest to him that Linda saved his life in more ways than one. Not just emotionally, but physically. There were times when his health began to falter, when the stress of performance and grief took a toll. And it was Linda who pushed him to rest, to see doctors, to slow down. She didn't lecture. She just watched him closely, knew the signs others missed. In recent years, Barry has spoken with a kind of vulnerability that surprises even longtime fans. He doesn't mask his sadness the way he used to. He doesn't deflect with humor as often. And when asked what he's most proud of, his answer has changed. It's not the records, not the tours, not the awards. It's his marriage. Because for over 50 years, through everything, Barry and Linda Gibb never stopped choosing each other. Day after day, grief after grief, life after loss. And when Barry finally sat down to reflect publicly on what that kind of love really means, on what it cost and what it gave, he didn't speak like a celebrity. He spoke like a man who finally realized the rarest thing in his life wasn't success. It was her. To understand what Linda meant to Barry, you have to understand what he lost. Barry Gibb didn't just lose his brothers. He lost his collaborators, his co-writers, his history. Each brother carried a different piece of who he was. And when they were gone, Barry wasn't just mourning the men. He was mourning the sound, the shorthand, the shared childhood that no one else could understand. And then, there was silence. Robin, Maurice, and Andy weren't just his family, they were his mirrors. With them, he never had to explain what he was feeling. They already knew. They had lived the same childhood, felt the same pressures, navigated the same spotlights. And when each one passed, that unspoken understanding disappeared. Barry became the last man standing, the lone survivor of a dynasty built on harmony. And the weight of that, of outliving all of them, was unbearable at times. But Linda never let him fall under it. When the world looked at Barry and saw strength, she saw fragility. She saw the nights he couldn't sleep, the moments he'd sit in a room full of music and still feel alone, the holidays that felt incomplete, the birthdays that carried more grief than joy. And slowly, gently, she reminded him that he wasn't just the last BG. He was still a husband, still a father, still a man with a life outside the legacy. That kind of grounding is what kept Barry from vanishing into his own myth. Because it would have been easy to disappear, to become a tribute act to the past, to live in archives and documentaries. But Linda didn't let that happen. She kept pulling him forward, not with force but with presence, with home-cooked meals, with family visits, with the quiet rituals that reminded Barry he was still here, still alive, still needed. And over time, Barry began to understand something he hadn't been able to say before, that Linda had sacrificed just as much as he had, maybe more. She had given up a normal life, private one. She had raised children in the shadow of relentless fame, protected them from headlines, taught them humility in the middle of global attention. She had absorbed his absences, his breakdowns, his silence. And she had done it without applause, without reward, without ever asking for recognition. She had watched as the world celebrated Barry, while she stood just behind the curtain. Unseen, unthanked, but essential. And now, in his 70s, Barry sees it clearly. He's begun mentioning her more often in interviews, not in passing, not as an obligatory thank you, but as the foundation of everything. He talks about how she held the family together, how she encouraged him to keep writing, how she was the first person to hear every song, and the only person whose opinion could change his mind. He started using phrases he never would have used decades ago. She saved me. She kept me grounded. She reminded me who I was. And maybe most tellingly, he no longer calls her his rock, because a rock just sits there, unmoving. Linda didn't sit still. She moved with him. She adjusted, shifted, stayed present. She chose to walk beside him when the road kept getting darker. She wasn't just strong. She was compassionate, intuitive, tireless. And Barry knows now he would have collapsed without her. That's the truth he's finally revealing. That behind the music, behind the legacy, behind the voice that defined an era, was a woman who asked for nothing, gave everything, and made sure he survived. Not because he was famous, but because he was hers. Now that Barry Gibb is 78, he speaks more slowly, more carefully, and more honestly than ever before. There's a softness in his voice now when he talks about Linda, not just as the love of his life, but as the reason he's still here to talk at all. Because as time passes and the spotlight dims, the truth becomes harder to ignore. Barry has outlived almost everyone he once built a life with. The Bee Gees aren't just a part of history, they are history. And Barry, as the last remaining thread, carries the burden of memory in a way that few people can truly understand. But he's not carrying it alone. Linda has always understood that her husband didn't just lose siblings. He lost parts of himself each time. And while others rushed to praise his resilience, she stayed focused on his humanity, on what he needed to keep moving, on what it cost him to be the strong one for everyone else. Even now, as Barry opens up more about his past, it's clear he does so with her in mind. His reflections aren't performative, they're protective. He doesn't want her to be remembered as the woman behind the man. He wants people to know she was the reason the man endured at all. There's a moment shared quietly with a family friend, not for a biography, not for press. When Barry was asked what his greatest fear was, he paused, then said, "Losing her, because without Linda, the silence would be complete. She's the one who knew him before the world did, before the suits and spotlights and screaming fans, before the tragedy, before the headlines, before the legacy. She's the only person left who knows what Barry Gibb was like before he became Barry Gibb. And that's something he treasures more than words. Over the years, she gave him the freedom to mourn in private. She protected the vulnerable parts of him from the world. And in doing so, she made room for him to grow old without being defined solely by what he lost. In recent years, they've been seen more together, quietly attending events, walking arm in arm, exchanging glances that say more than words ever could. It's not the glamour that draws attention anymore. It's the comfort, the way they exist near each other, like two people who have truly lived side by side. Through all of it, their love story isn't dramatic. It's not filled with tabloid scandal or public declarations. It's filled with loyalty, sacrifice, endurance, and a quiet, enduring bond that survived what so many others couldn't. When Barry speaks of Andy now, or Maurice, or Robin, his voice always dips. There's sorrow, yes, but also a kind of peace. And that peace didn't come naturally. It was earned, over years, through Linda's patience, her presence, her gentle reminders that even when people are gone, love doesn't leave with them. And that, perhaps, is her greatest gift. She gave Barry permission to let go without forgetting, to keep singing without guilt, to carry their memory without being buried under it. So when Barry finally reveals the truth about his wife, he's not telling a story about her. He's telling a story about what she gave him. Space to be broken, time to rebuild, and the strength to keep going when everyone else was gone. He doesn't say it with fanfare. He doesn't make a speech. But if you listen closely, in his recent words, you can hear it. Linda wasn't just his wife. She was the reason Barry Gibb didn't disappear into grief. The reason the music didn't stop. The reason the story kept going. And now, he's finally letting the world see the woman who saved him. Barry Gibb never needed the world to understand Linda. He spent most of his life protecting her from it. From the noise, from the scrutiny, from the pressure that fame brings. And she never asked for more than that. But now, after more than 50 years of quiet sacrifice, quiet strength, and quiet love, he's finally lifting the curtain. Not to make her a headline, but to make sure her place in his story is never forgotten. Because when the music fades and the stages go dark, what remains isn't legacy, it's love. And Barry Gibb knows exactly who gave him the strength to hold on to it all. For more emotional stories, check out this video.